Hello and welcome to That's Not Spit, It's Condensation. I'm Ryan Beach, and today I am glad to have my good friend Stephen Wadsack on the podcast. Stephen teaches trumpet at Wright State University. He lives in Cincinnati and does a fair amount of freelancing in the tri-state area, which is Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, if I'm not wrong. Is that correct?
You got it, man.
Yeah, look at me. Stephen recently went through an audition process, and he used a program that I wrote for him, and he even allowed me to coach him through the process. Sometimes he would send me messages saying, here's what's going on, or here's things I'm struggling with, and I would be able to give him some feedback. He'd send me recordings, just kind of the whole process. Maybe not so much of me teaching him, but me just supporting him throughout the process. So for me, a big part of this is just to get feedback from him. What worked, what didn't work, what kinds of things would he change in the future, if there's anything like that. But for you listening, I hope that this can be an interesting dive into how he prepared for this audition, and maybe you'll find some things for yourself that you might want to take for your next audition as well. So before we get into it, I just want to say thank you for being here. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here with you.
So before we get into the actual audition, it might be great to just kind of root ourselves in why you took this audition, why you wanted to try this style of preparation for this audition. Just help us understand the motivation for this approach.
Sure. Well, first, I have to say, any opportunity to work with Ryan Beach, you got to say yes to that. But beyond that,
I did not tell him to say that.
No, he did not. Check is not in the mail, I don't think. But beyond that, something that Ryan and I had been having a conversation about is I'm getting to a stage in my life and in my career where I'm very fortunate to have a wide variety of opportunities. As he mentioned, I have a full-time job teaching at university, and I also stay pretty active as a freelancer. And while that is tremendous and it's everything I've hoped for and aspired to have in my career, it's also created some opportunities to reflect and think about what kind of life I want to live and how busy I actually want to be, having time available in my schedule and my life to pursue other things, to pursue meaningful relationships. And so part of why I wanted to take this audition is because it was an opportunity to win a chair in an orchestra. And I saw that as a way to kind of simplify my gigging life a little bit. A unique aspect of my life is I live in Cincinnati. I teach at a university that's right around an hour away. So I'm automatically spending around 10 hours a week just driving to and from work. And then on top of that, anyone who lives the freeway Philharmonic life knows that you can spend a lot of time driving to and from services as well. So having a spot in an orchestra with guaranteed services and having the guarantee of knowing that I would get to play a certain number of masterwork concerts each year, maybe get to check some pieces off my bucket list of things I really want to perform, was an opportunity to just simplify things. And then thinking a step or two ahead, I was even considering, in the event that I win this audition, maybe that allows me the freedom to let go of some other things that I don't necessarily need to be holding on to anymore.
Yeah. And so that helps us understand for this audition in particular, which is interesting because for me, when I took auditions, it was just, I would like to have the ability to make money,
Yeah.
And so it's nice to hear that for you, you're in a position in life where the audition isn't necessarily everything for you, but it is something that would be a positive or a good thing in your life still. And obviously the pursuit of an audition in and of itself is a good thing. And so, do you want to speak a little bit to why you wanted to try this gold method type of programming for the audition?
Sure. Yeah. So full disclosure, I have not taken a whole lot of auditions. When I was in graduate school at CCM working on my master's in trumpet performance, I took a few auditions for regional orchestras around the tri-state and did not have a ton of success. Generally, I would not make it through prelims. There were a couple times where I did advance, and that felt really good. But frankly, I discovered a passion for teaching pretty early on, and I had a lot of success in that vein of my career. And so I pursued that because it was really gratifying and I was experiencing success. Students were starting to reach out to me, and it even got to the point where I wasn't even needing to recruit for myself as much. And so the auditions thing kind of took a sideline as I started to pursue teaching more and more. So when I started to think about this audition, I really felt like I needed some guidance and some help in terms of how to structure my preparation, and even just a great set of ears to give me some perspective on stylistic nuance. These are all things that I got in my education at CCM, but it had been several years since I had taken an audition. And also given the fact that I had never really like advanced to a final round or actually won one of those auditions, I wanted to have some help.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, just to make sure I'm understanding. For you, a big part of it was just wanting someone who's been through the audition process to help walk you through the audition process, to maybe try to have a better outcome than you would, or at least kind of getting that kind of perspective from someone like me. I've taken, in the 20s of auditions, which is not nearly as many as some other people, but I do have a fair amount of experience. And so would you say that's sort of an accurate summary of that, or do I have something wrong?
No, I would say you're right on the money there. And I think your last statement really encapsulates that. As someone who had only taken, I think, 4 auditions prior to this one, I have been around in this industry long enough to know that that's not very many. And one of the best ways that we learn how to succeed in auditions is by taking them. There's so many people out there who have talked about there's almost sort of like a critical mass or like a number of auditions that you take, and the experiences and the wisdom that you learn through that process. I was looking for that, certainly.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into the process itself. It can be quite overwhelming, I think, if you get very granular with things. And so to keep things digestible, I think the easiest way to do it would just to be to talk about the process in the different phases. And so if you want to sort of speak, I'd love to hear your version of it, right? I could talk all day about this, but I'd love to hear from your perspective what the phases were, what the focus of each phase was, and then we can get into the challenges and things like that later. But just kind of walk us through the actual sort of structure of the preparation the best that you remember it.
Yeah. So to my recollection, the first thing that needed to happen was I needed to get a hold of the list and provide that with Ryan. And then we spent some time talking about a goal tempo for each excerpt, as well as I needed to do some homework of matching each excerpt with some interpretations that really clicked well with me. So I spent a few hours listening to my favorite recordings of these excerpts. And it was a fairly short excerpt list compared to some bigger auditions that you might see for like a larger orchestra. I think there were 8 or 9, something like that. But regardless, took some time listening to a few recordings of each from among my favorites, and then choosing one that I felt matched the interpretation I wanted to have. And once I sent that information to Ryan, he provides me with basically a checklist of what I need to be practicing each time I sit down to run the program, how many repetitions I'm going to do, what tempo I'm going to do those repetitions at. And then that's the first part of it. But then the second part of it is recording each and every repetition that I do, listening back to those recordings. And when I'm listening back, I'm looking for holes in my technique, or I'm looking for inconsistencies in my stylistic interpretation. And then really just taking detailed and copious notes on what I'm hearing and discovering, so that I have that to refer back to and start the subsequent practice sessions with as a starting point, basically. How'd I do?
Yeah, that's great. That's phase 1. What about phase 2?
So phase 2, things change a little bit. Let's see here.
If you don't remember, I can fill in the gaps. It's all good.
I'm drawing a little bit of a blank here.
Yeah, phase 2. So phase 2, what we do in phase 1 is we just extract all the most technical excerpts, or the unfamiliar excerpts. And so with a list of 8 or 9, that's not going to be very many, but in a list of like 40 excerpts, it can be very helpful to take out the most difficult ones, so that you're almost trying to raise the floor, right? You're trying to say, these ones that are hard, I'm going to try to get those better to more match the level of the excerpts I'm already familiar with. In phase 2, then we practice all of the excerpts, and you have a 2 repetition scheme. The first repetition is a performance tempo repetition. The second repetition is going to be a drop tempo, where you have the opportunity to drive in any good habits that you want to keep from the performance tempo repetition, or where you can adjust anything necessary and then have the ability to actually imprint good habits because it's slower. And when you practice each excerpt is just dependent on the level of difficulty for you at that time. How's that for a jumping off point?
That's great. And actually, I'm kind of laughing to myself now that I needed the refresher, because listening to you talk about it reminds me that phase 2 is like my favorite phase in the process. And I think it's because for me, phase 2 is usually where I start to see the growth and the improvement. And that gets me really excited and motivates me to keep going. You get that performance repetition, that performance tempo repetition, and it just really reveals like where you are losing your focus or where you are getting off track. And then you have that second repetition immediately after to just try to grind that out or iron that out. And, doing that over a period of several days, going back and listening to a recording from, say, 6 days ago compared to the one today, for me, that's a point in the process where you can really start to see how far you've come in just a short period of time. And that's always really fun and fulfilling. So,
yeah. I want to come back to a couple of things you said about losing focus and motivation, but to finish this part of it out, there's a third and final phase. What can you tell us about that phase?
So the third and final phase, specifically for Audition, is you are doing full run-throughs of the list of excerpts. And the approach that we took was Ryan helped me generate some random orderings of lists. That way I'm playing the full list twice a day in a completely random order. And we would simulate the audition environment a little bit by, I would have 3 to 5 minutes to warm up and do whatever I needed to do on each instrument that I was using for the list, which in this case was 4 different trumpets. So I would get to play on those for a few minutes, then take a short break to sort of simulate how your chops can cool down in that time between when you leave the warm-up room and actually when you get to stage and get to play. And then playing the entire list straight down, taking the same amount of time in between each excerpt that you would take in the actual audition round, and trying to make that as realistic as possible. While I'm doing this, or while anyone is doing this, you've got the recorder running the whole time. And then once you're done with that, immediately listen back to that recording, notice what went well, notice where you deviated from your plan, notice inconsistencies in terms of time, pitch, style, whatever it may be. While you're listening back to that recording, that's also kind of building in like a natural organic chop break. And then once you've done that, run the list a second time, trying to take all of that input and feedback that you got from the recording and implementing that into your second run through. And that second run through of the list, without fail, for me each time was where I would make big strides and just be able to reinforce good habits and good approaches to the excerpts. So
I do want to say, too, that with a list of 8 or 9 excerpts, you do have the ability to run the whole list twice. But when you have a list of something like 30 or 40 excerpts, what I generally recommend is to split the list to split the list in half or maybe in 2/3. And you're going to run half the list each day, or you're going to run 2/3 of the list each day. And then, so if you have, I can't do this like math real quick, but if you have 40 excerpts, 2/3 of the list would be like 32 excerpts or 28 excerpts or something. So let's say, just to round it off, you have 30 excerpts that you have to do in a day. What I would do is 5 rounds of 6 excerpts, so that you can, like exactly what you said, you can build in some rest. You're not just trying to play 30 excerpts back to back to back to back to back, but you're not just like putting breaks in there, but then you're also like what's important about this phase is that you're practicing going through everything about a list, the mental approach to doing it, the warm up to doing it, the feeling of cooling down, everything you just said. That's the point of this phase. So you want to try to give yourself as many opportunities to simulate an actual list. Hopefully all that made sense in terms of what you would do in a bigger list situation. But for you, yeah, we could program doing the list twice and you would get all of that feedback. Real quick, I want to talk about, you said when I do these lists, it allows me to check if I'm losing focus. And then you also said it's motivating to see the progress. Can you speak a little bit more to how important focus is into the process, and then speak a little bit towards how seeing progress is motivating versus just trying to come up with motivation? Like, I feel like motivation is a topic people like to ask questions about. So I'd be curious for your take on that.
yeah, man, totally. So going to the focus point first, as I'm getting further and further into my career, and as I'm starting to figure out what really works best for me in terms of practice, I'm learning quickly that when I am struggling with something or when I'm hitting an impasse or a roadblock, anything that's hindering my progress, almost all the time, trying not to exaggerate here, but it's truly like almost 100% of the time, I find that it's because my focus has shifted or because I'm not focused on the right thing. And so I've started to even test this hypothesis with my students at Wright State. If they're struggling with something, whether it's a Clark study or an Arbin arpeggio pattern or an etude, the first question I will often ask them when they're done is, what were you thinking about during that repetition? Or what was your keystone focus for that repetition? And most of the time, if the response comes back and is something other than I was focusing on the sound quality that I wanted to have, or I was focused on the pattern I'm supposed to be playing, then they probably didn't have a very good representation of what they were trying to do. And so I've just been collecting all of this, and kind of using it as anecdotal information to start to formulate some thoughts and opinions about how important focus is. But then in my own preparation of these lists, if there was an excerpt in particular that was giving me a hard time, which we can talk about the specifics of what some of those were, if we want to, oftentimes Ryan would ask me, okay, well, what are you focused on when you play this? And usually by changing my focal point or just by making sure that I am more focused on what I'm supposed to be focused on, we were able to get me playing that particular excerpt better than I had played it previously.
Yeah. Yeah, I think focus is everything. I also agree with you. I know that's why I would ask those questions,
Yeah.
And there's scientific stuff to back up why focus is important. I don't think we have time to get into that right now, but it is a very important part of the process, and I'm glad you're digging into it as well, because I think it's important. What about the motivation side? I think a lot of people are often like, I don't feel motivated to do things. I don't feel motivated to practice, or I don't feel motivated to do this. You spoke to saying that you seeing progress from day 1 to day 6 in that second phase was very motivating for you. And so I'm just curious for what is your take on finding and feeling motivation during your practice sessions, and how you might more reliably go about getting that?
So my philosophy on motivation is evolving right now, and I think for the better. And I wish that I knew who to attribute this to. I can't remember where I saw this or who I heard this from. But recently I've been thinking about the idea of which came first, the chicken or the egg, like that whole thing, but applying it to motivation. This idea of, do I need to be motivated to go and do the work? Or is motivation a byproduct of doing the work? And I'm starting to find myself agreeing with the latter of those two, which is, I need to put the work in. And then when I start to see progress as a result of that work, I then find motivation because I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing, and that motivates me to continue. But I'm sure you have heard this. I hear this all the time. And I'm sure many viewers or listeners of this will have heard people say, I'm just not motivated to do X, Y, Z, or I wish I could find the motivation. But what I'm finding in my own experience, and I'd be curious to see if research backs this up too, is that really it's the inverse. We sometimes need to take that first step, even if we really don't feel like it, even if we're kind of frustrated with the trumpet that day. Sometimes just the act of picking it up and getting started will then motivate us to continue. And that has certainly been my experience recently. I was pretty into this audition preparation. I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed the music I was playing. But there were some days where I would finish working a 12-hour day and I really didn't feel like playing my list. I just wanted to come home, take off my shoes, maybe have a nice beverage before bed or something. But I was committed to the process and committed to seeing it through. And usually by the time I got a few minutes in, I was having a great time and I wanted to continue that work.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear. I mean, there would not have been anything wrong with you not practicing on it after a 12-hour day, like there's no pressure from outside, but it's cool to see that's how committed you were. And maybe you want to speak a little bit to how having a plan might have encouraged you to just dive in versus the mental bandwidth you would have had to have spent trying to figure out what to do after a 12-hour day. Do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, having that plan truly made it possible. I'm not sure that if I had to come up with that plan on my own each and every day, especially after the really long, grueling days, that I would have been able to have that follow through. I also think having the plan helped in a sense because I saw it as an agreement or a contract of sorts. Like I'm working with Ryan on this and it's a partnership and he's taken the time and the effort to help me. And so the least I could do is hold up my end of this agreement and this contract, which is to do the things that we've agreed I'm going to do. And if I'm not doing that, the only person I'm really shortchanging is myself. But then I'm also kind of like abusing my friend's time here, who's like putting time and effort into trying to help me be better as well. And that's something that I've started to have some conversations with students about too, is really like when you enter a relationship with someone of, okay, we're going to work on this together to try to help you make strides. Who are we hurting if we don't do that work? Or who are we hurting if we decide, hey, I really don't need to do this today? I'm not at all saying that you should not set boundaries and that you need to like practice 6 hours a day every day. That's not what this is. But what I am saying, just some food for thought, is be mindful of, when you commit to something and when you put your word to something and say, I'm going to do this, be mindful of, am I really able to look in the mirror at the end of the day and say that I did what I said I was going to do? And the details of that will be different for each person. In my case, it was committing to doing this preparation 6 days a week with one off day each week. And I can confidently say that I did do that. So.
Yeah, that's very, very well said. I think we should talk about some of the challenges. We're sort of in this like area of like, I've committed to doing it and I want to make sure I can look at myself in the mirror. Well, what types of things did you encounter that made it hard? We already talked about sort of the time commitment for you. At some days I just was so busy, it was hard to fit it in. Let's talk about some of the physical things that you encountered. Maybe excerpts that didn't pan out the way you wanted them to, or just any kind of physical thing like that. And then we'll move on to some of the more mental challenges.
Oh yeah. This is where it gets fun. Obviously I'm a teacher and I'm a professional, and I know some teachers and some professionals would not particularly enjoy like talking about the things that they're not good at on a video that a lot of people might watch and hear. But I kind of like that because I think it's important that we are vulnerable and honest about like what our strengths are and also what our weaknesses are. And for me, there were 2, maybe 3 excerpts on this list that I had big mental hangups with, in part because in previous audition experiences, I had not done so well on these excerpts. And so there were some physical manifestations of those mental hangups that I had to work through. But here's the really cool part. And, the spoiler alert, if you will, is like, I got a lot better at these excerpts and now I can play them way better than I used to. The one of them was the offstage lyrical excerpt from Pines, which I know a lot of people who feel like that excerpt comes really naturally to them and is not necessarily like a hard excerpt because from a technical standpoint, it's a nice, beautiful melody. But for me, that was an excerpt I had consistently struggled with in terms of just getting through it with a sound that had ease and resonance and great core on each note. So that was a challenge that I had to work through. For me, the key to success with that excerpt, a lot of it had to do with working with Ryan to just find a sound that was more free on each note. And in terms of process, like what helped me do that was playing the excerpt really slowly and just going like one phrase at a time, trying to make each phrase sound as beautiful and free and effortless as possible. And then extending that to, okay, now I'm going to do that with 2 phrases. Now let's see if I can do that with 3 phrases. And just meeting my body and my mental state where it was. So some days having success with that, and then some days not having success with that. But over the long term, like the full large picture, having a major amount of success. And I would say that was one of the excerpts that I felt best about by the end of my preparation.
So even though you were playing generally a slow excerpt, you found slowing down a slow excerpt to be beneficial. I feel like this is a hang up for some people sometimes. Like, why would I slow down something that's slow? I don't need you to cover it again, but I just wanted to point that out, that there is a time and a place for even doing something like that. Because if you can't manage the skill you're trying to do, which is playing with a particular sound in a particular context, slowing it down is still like a good idea, even if the thing you're starting with is already pretty slow. So you can continue.
Yeah. I would say another excerpt that I definitely had some hangups with, and there were some physical things I had to work through, was the prelude from Carmen with some of the low trumpet stuff. So I had played this excerpt in an audition previously, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was the fourth excerpt in the round, and the third excerpt was Mahler 5, and I really went for it. I played a great Mahler 5, but I also just like totally like went all out on Mahler 5. And so then I go to play Carmen, and I'm totally spread and I'm blown out, and I had like such a horrible experience with that excerpt. They ended up saying thank you, right after that excerpt, and I knew I was done and was probably not advancing. And the way that manifested itself in my playing was I got really shaky and just couldn't find focus on any of those notes below the staff. So I wasn't getting good response or good resonance. Again, working on that excerpt, what was really helpful for me was going incredibly slowly, figuring out exactly what I needed to be doing with my air, having a very, very, very vivid mental, what's the word I'm looking for?
Representation.
Yes, thank you. Representation or reference for what I wanted it to sound like. And then just it being insistent that I was getting the quality of sound that I wanted on every single note and not moving on until I got that, which meant that I spent a lot of time going, da, 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 right? And maybe sitting on just one of those notes for what felt like a long time, or even several minutes before moving on to the next one and then the next one. But that's an excerpt I feel like I can play much better now. And from time to time, sometimes if I'm not in the right frame of mind and if I'm not focused on the right things, some of those old habits will start to creep back in there. And then that's a reminder for me of, okay, no, I can do this in a different way now. I can do this better. And it's still a work in progress, but I would say I'm much more consistent on that excerpt, and I feel like I can play it really well now.
Nice. Yeah. There's one more, right? One third excerpt that you said was a challenge for you?
Yeah, and that would be Schumann 2. So noticing a pattern here, possibly with some of the low trumpet stuff. And this audition,
either excerpt, the first trumpet or the second trumpet excerpt, for different reasons. For me, that's also been a sort of a bane of my existence. I have just struggled with playing it too soft. It's one of those excerpts that I think teaches you the difference between playing soft and playing with a soft sound. And I think you maybe you can speak to that. But that took me a long time to really understand. But we're not in that excerpt. We're not just trying to play scary soft to show off that we can play soft. But really, it's, can you play with a soft sound that sounds beautiful, and then play the line, like play the line there. And it took me a long time to figure that out. So I'm just laughing because that has also been a difficult excerpt for me to and again, like the way you're talking, what I see now is I would just try to get better at it. But now I'm trying to think, what is the problem here? Like, what am I actually struggling with, and how do I come up with a solution for that problem? And I think that thinking that way in my most recent auditions helped me to actually make some progress. So sorry to interrupt you there, but I also have struggled with this. That's why I was laughing.
No, that's great. And it's always good to commiserate with somebody. So
sure.
A welcome interruption. I think taking that last thing you just said about identifying what is the problem that's holding me back. For me, in this excerpt, it was definitely the way I was using my air. I think because I was trying so hard to play with a soft and delicate sound, I was doing things to manipulate my air. And so doing that hard work, and really it's not hard work, I shouldn't say hard work, doing that work that can be very fun and rewarding of figuring out how do I play at this dynamic level while still being insistent with the blow, feeling the wind at my lips, and making sure that the note speaks with great clarity and great resonance was what it took for me to get this excerpt happening. And then the other thing that I needed to be reminded of, this was kind of a stylistic thing that Ryan coached me on, is everything else that's happening in the orchestra when you play this excerpt pretty much is fairly sustained, and there's a lyricism to it. There's a overarching phrase to it. But we have to remember that this trumpet part is still supposed to be a fanfare. And so there were some things that Ryan and I talked about in terms of how I was placing the 16th notes, how much space there should or should not be between those notes. And there were some things that I changed with that, which both made it a better stylistic interpretation, but also, frankly, made it a little bit easier to play the excerpt, because I was trying to do some things that were just making it harder than it needed to be.
Yeah. You don't have to go into super depth if you don't want to on this, but I'm very interested for you to speak to just how it evolves over time, right? Because you're struggling with this. And I think this is an important point to help, or at least to speak to. When you get feedback on something or you hear something in a recording and you identify this is what I want to get better at, I would imagine it did not immediately. Well, sometimes maybe some things improved, but other things like Carmen or Schumann too took some time to improve. So can you speak a little bit about the length of time maybe some of these things took before you really started to get some consistency with it? And then maybe you can use that to transition into the mental game. Like, how do you stay strong mentally when you're working through issues that aren't just fixing themselves immediately?
Yes. I think this is super important too. And a quick sidebar, in order to answer this question from Ryan, either you have to have a really, really great memory or you have to be pretty diligent about taking notes and documenting the process. And that was something he and I talked about from the beginning, is make sure that as much as you can, you are taking notes and that you are documenting this in such a way so that it can be useful for you in the future. And so I can actually tell exactly when some of these excerpts started to click, because I can go back to my practice journal and see the day where I wrote, yeah, like I finally got this. And I played this in the way that I'm hearing it in my head. And using Carmen as an example, I think it was probably, I was looking at this just the other day because I was showing it to one of my students at Wright State. I think it was early in the 4th week when I really started to feel like I was owning Carmen, and that I was consistently able to play it the way that I was hearing it in my head without any shake in the sound and with good response and good sound on all of the low register stuff. So it took some time. How do we not get discouraged while we're waiting those 3 or 4 weeks? I think a lot of it comes down to you have to trust the process. If you cannot trust that the process is going to work, then you're sort of dead in the water. There has to be a belief that what you're doing will pay off if you are persistent and you have the right target and you have the right frame of mind. And I think that ultimately is tied to a growth mindset. In order to trust the process, you have to believe that you are capable of doing the thing that you're trying to do and that you will get better with time. And again, this is something that has shaped my teaching at Wright State. We're big into growth mindset, and we don't always call it that. Like, we don't always explicitly reference it as such. I don't come into studio class and say, hey, remember guys and gals, growth mindset, right? But it's more an attitude of believing that you are capable of the task you're trying to achieve, and then celebrating the wins, no matter how big or how small they may be.
That's awesome. Couldn't have said it better. That's so cool, man. How about, that's sort of the mental game in terms of just staying consistent and trying to keep like that good outlook when you're struggling. What about the mental game sort of overall, right? The mental game of what am I thinking about and how am I going to dial that in? And then when I get to the actual audition, how am I keeping my mind in a good place? Does that question, like sort of the big picture of what do I want to be thinking about during each excerpt? Like, how did you use the process itself to begin to craft not just consistency in your playing, but also in your mental approach?
Yes. For me, this one is harder. And this took some experimentation and some trial and error. But what I found to be most helpful with getting in the right frame of mind and having the correct focal points was experimenting and finding phrases or words or even like a tonal space that could be a keyword or a trigger for me to get into the right headspace. And I played around with different words. So for some of my excerpts, I have 2 or 3 words written down at the top, and then I would find the one that, okay, when I really focus on this aspect of this excerpt, or when I really focus on this adjective, I get a better result. Sometimes it was a mechanical thing. Like, okay, I need to be really mindful of time. One of the excerpts was from Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. I needed to spend a lot of time thinking about the type of articulation I was playing with, specifically getting more front to each note than I thought I needed. But then getting that feedback from not just Ryan, actually, but even some other people that I played for who said, hey, you need more pop on this articulation. So my keyword for that excerpt was literally just articulate. And I had that written out like in bold face and underlined. And I was just really thinking about getting clarity and pop on the front of each note. And it took some time to find those too. I think I already said that, but I said it again. So sometimes I had to live with something for a couple of weeks before I found what that key word was going to be or that focal point was going to be.
And I imagine that's some of the fun of the process, is it turns it from this like grueling, like I'm either good enough or I'm not, into I'm just going to explore a little bit and learn what works for me and what things may not work for me, and to be able to start to understand how I might play with more consistency. And you're using this audition process to do it. And so hopefully we're going to talk about the result of the audition next. Hopefully, regardless of the result of the audition, you can walk away feeling like it was a positive experience. So like you can win whether you win or lose. I think that's an important part that I'm hoping to share. So can you tell us about the result of the audition, how you felt in that result, and then sort of what you feel about the process overall?
Yeah. So the fact is, I did all of this preparation. I worked really hard. And I did not win the audition. I did not end up winning the spot that was open. However, I am still feeling and treating it as if it were a monumental success because I improved so much. And frankly, I'm at a stage in my life where improving and getting better and learning more about the process of improving and getting better is ultimately, to me, more valuable and worth more than winning that spot in the orchestra. It would have been great to have both, right? But I know that I represented myself really well. I was able to play the entire list. I got really good feedback after the audition about how I played and that there were a lot of things that went really well. And I learned so much about how to approach learning music, how to approach teaching, just how to approach mindset. And to me, that all makes it incredibly valuable and worthwhile. You could look at that as, wow, you spent all this time preparing and you didn't come away with the prize you had hoped for. But in my mind, I came away with a prize that's even more valuable than the one I initially set out to get. And I still get to play with that orchestra a lot too. So that's cool.
Yeah, I think that's such an important story to tell. And I'm glad that you're willing to come on the podcast and tell that story, because when I was younger, that's not the story I was telling myself. The story I was telling myself was, if I don't win it, it's a waste of time. And so I spent a lot of time on this emotional roller coaster, not able to understand there's value outside of the actual result itself. And in many ways, you're not in control of the result, especially in an audition. And something like a recital, we've worked together in that capacity. That's a little bit different. It's just kind of a free, open-ended, you're just preparing to do your best. In an audition, it can feel like a lot more pressure because there's sort of assessment or judgment involved of your playing. So it's a good story to hear that you feel like it was a monumental success, even if you didn't get the outcome we wanted. I'm curious. I'm going to try to summarize some of the good things that you were talking about, and then I'd love to hear if there's anything what you feel like you would do differently in the next preparation. So to me, it sounds like one of the biggest factors for you was just was time. Like you didn't have to spend time thinking about what to do. So when you had time in your busy schedule, you could just dive right in. The other thing that was beneficial about this process was being able to work with me. You're able to sort of get a lot of feedback on just the audition process itself, so that you could look for some stylistic things on excerpts or just approaches to how to go about breaking down a list. And then the third big thing is just the experimentation, turning it into a fun process instead of it being such a grinding experience. You could experiment with, how do I need to play this, and what solutions can I find, and mentally, what do I need to be thinking about? And so even though you didn't win, you learned all of this stuff, and that was maybe the biggest overall positive, is that you could still walk away with like the feeling that you learned all of these things. What things would you do differently next time? That could be doing a different, changing the program itself if there's things you didn't like, or maybe you liked the program, but there's things you want to do differently next time to see if you can get even more out of it. I'm very curious, more curious for this than anything else we've talked about. What would you do differently?
Cool. So two things come to mind for me that I would do differently. And one of them is hard because it is a symptom of the stage of life that I'm in and how busy I am. But one thing I would do differently is I would carve out a little bit of additional time after I had done the program to just spend more time refining fundamentals related to whatever mechanical things are holding me back in terms of playing the excerpts. It's tough to do that as a full-time college teacher and as someone who has a freelance schedule where maybe I didn't even get out of an orchestra service until 10 o'clock. And then I'm still an hour and 10 minutes from home. And then I have to drive home. And then I'm practicing my excerpts in my basement while my wife is sleeping upstairs. In a perfect world, I would then still have some time to like refine fundamentals a little bit. But there were some days where that just wasn't possible. So I would love to be able to include that in the process of running the program, just having like really focused time to work on each of those fundamental elements that is holding me back in an excerpt, but have that be part of the program almost, like do that consistently every day. And I did do that on some days when I had the time, but there were other days where I just couldn't. And then I think the second thing I would do differently is way back at the beginning, before you even start phase one of the program, I mentioned that one of the things that I did with Ryan was we talked about a goal tempo for each excerpt. And then I spent some time selecting recordings. I think something I could have done a better job of was being a little more discerning with the recordings that I selected. I picked recordings that I really liked and that I enjoyed the interpretation of. But there are some things that you need to be mindful of when you're taking an audition. And there are different philosophies on this. Some people say you should approach auditions and play everything exactly the way that you want to play it and the way you think it should go. And then there are other people who say that it's a little bit safer to take, I don't want to use the word homogenized, but a more standard interpretation perhaps, because you're showing that you have a knowledge of how these things are to be played. And then when you get maybe into a semifinal or a final round, you can be a little bit more expressive or a little bit more soloistic in terms of how you interpret it. This audition was for a third trumpet position in a regional orchestra. So they're probably not looking for someone to come in and be like super soloistic in terms of how they're interpreting these excerpts. But I noticed over time that some of the excerpt recordings I had chosen were, shall we say, like non-standard, right? And so there were some moments as I got 3 or 4 weeks into the program where I realized I've been listening to a recording for about a month long that does it this way. But then when I sit down to actually try to execute and play it, I'm going for an interpretation that's a little bit more like this, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I think one way to combat that would be to just be a little more careful when I pick recordings, or to maybe have more than one recording for each excerpt that I'm referencing as well.
Yeah. I would say, hopefully this is encouraging for you, I would say that part of it is like you just don't know, right? Especially when you're relatively new to auditions, you just don't know. And you're just going to pick the best thing you know. And then, like you said, about a month in, you're like, I've actually now spent time with this excerpt. I've developed what I think is a good way to go about doing this. And like that comes in conflict with whatever the recording is that I've listened to. And so I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that instead of just saying, I'm going to blindly copy this recording, I'm actually trying to develop my own understanding of this. And you did that to a point where you could actually have an opinion enough to say, I've actually like done this incorrectly. Now, also to your point, that would then lead you to the same exact conclusion, right? That you're like, okay, I should just like pick better recordings, but you still guaranteed will feel this almost the same exact way the next time around, right?
Yeah.
That when you won't run into this is when you don't really need to listen to recordings to do this at all, because you've just prepared the excerpts enough that, separate from trying to refamiliarize yourself with the excerpts and get context, you like know what you want to do with them, right? And that just comes from taking lots of auditions. So if it's any encouragement, I don't know if there's ever a perfect scenario where it's like I listened to the right recording right from the beginning. I think you're going to keep developing and changing, and and you'll hear from different, like you said, you'll hear from different people, and they have different opinions about how these different excerpts should go. And you're trying to assimilate all that, but ultimately you want your version of it. So for me, when I took the Cincinnati and St. Louis auditions earlier in last year, I listened to some recordings for context towards the beginning and to get tempos and things like that. But after that, I didn't listen to a lot of other people's recordings. I listen to a lot of my recordings, but I've taken so many. I've got some very strong formulated thoughts. If that's of any encouragement in that way, like I think it'll just kind of be this way until you get to a point where you're like, I kind of know what I'm doing, if that makes sense. Because those recordings are a reflection of a specific conductor in a specific group at a specific time, and it's like those are very, very valuable from a musical standpoint. But when you're trying to put it together for an audition, it's almost as valuable just to say, why is this on the list? And then how do I demonstrate these skills in the musical context that the music presents it in? So hopefully that's helpful. Is there anything, I'm sort of done out of questions. Is there anything you kind of want to say to close us out here that you may not have been able to say?
I don't think so. I think we've really covered most aspects of what I would want to share with people and make sure that people know. I just want to say again, like, I have a lot of gratitude to you for working through this process with me. I feel like in the future, if I decide to take more orchestral auditions, not only would I have more success, but I would enjoy the process of preparing a lot more. I talk to so many students and also colleagues that are preparing for auditions, and the way in which they talk about that process is even just kind of demoralizing. Like, oh, I got to prepare all this music for another dumb audition, right? But frankly, most days I looked forward to doing that practice and I wanted to do it. And so beyond just making my preparation more efficient, saving time, improving my process and the amount of progress I saw, it also just helped me to enjoy it more. And so I'm grateful to you, Ryan, for that and for that opportunity.
That's awesome, man. I'm glad that that's what you took away, because I have found that with these programs and then understanding how to use them. And it's very encouraging for me to hear that you're also getting a similar thing out of it. So thank you for being willing to do this. I think to close out, you just want to share where people might be able to find you and get in touch with you if they are interested in sharing their thoughts with you or saying anything about this episode. Where would they find you?
Absolutely. So I'm on the major social media platforms. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram. It's simple. It's just my name, Stephen Wadsack. You can also find me at Wright State University's website. My email address is stephen.wadsack@wright.edu. And you can also find me on my website at stephenwadsack.com. And I would love to hear from anybody or chat if somebody wants to follow up. So,
is that how you say your last name?
Yeah.
It's not Wadsack?
No.
Wadsack? I don't think I knew that.
It's okay.
I feel like we had this exact conversation last time we had a podcast episode.
We may have. It's okay.
Where you said that, and I was like, is that how you say your last name? I might remember it this time. Well, anyway, I appreciate you being on the episode. For me, this is a lot of really great information. I hope the whoever's listening got a lot out of it too, got some things that they could try out on their next audition list. I just also want to thank Brandon Yoakum for his work on mastering this episode of the podcast. You can find Brandon at epiphanyrecordingstudio.com. And most of all, I'd like to thank you for listening. Have a great day, I guess, and we'll see you in the next episode.